Thank you very much. And it is indeed a seamless transition from copyright to accessibility. And I want to talk about accessibility maturity because it was 21 years ago, well, 22 years ago now, 1999, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1 were published. So we've had 22 years. So that's definitely come of age. Is it mature, is the question. Now, what I want to do is to unpack a little bit about what accessibility in a digital context means. And then to move from that to talk about, well, what does that mean as a human being, not as a technical person? And how do we measure within an organization accessibility maturity? So I'm going to start off just by talking about digital accessibility as a skill gap, because if I was to give you, and I had my, yeah, here we are here. If I've got a printed book or piece of paper or something that is produced professionally by typesetters and all the rest of it, it doesn't actually have very much more accessibility built into it as a hard copy than if an amateur put together something for the local cub group, because I can't make that content change its size, change its font. I can't automatically navigate through it by heading levels, bring up a list of headings and so on. I can't make it speak to me. So the skill gap in terms of creating accessible hard copy content is actually very small. The difference between a professional and an amateur is negligible. That is not the same when you begin to look at digital content, because if I look at what an amateur might create in terms of an online Word document and what somebody with proper professional digital skills could create in terms of the accessibility they could put in there, if they know what they're doing, the gap between an amateur production, an amateur Word document, PowerPoint and so on, and a professional one is enormous. And that's what we're talking about with accessibility. It's about why is that gap, why is that potential not realized? What are the skill gaps that need to be fixed? And there is often this sense of, well, actually accessibility, that's so in the organization deals with that, or that's the disability team, as if accessibility is a profession. Now, it is not a profession. It is not a specialism. It's a way of work. And in fact, I talked in the kind of blurb for the conference about it being the equivalent of somebody working in the restaurant trade not knowing about hygiene or not knowing about allergies, because it's that fundamental thing that everybody in a restaurant food chain, from the owner ordering things through to the people that store it, the chef that cooks it, and the waiter that serves it, everybody needs to understand the basics of hygiene. They understand it in different ways, but accessibility is the same kind of thing. It is not a profession, it is a professionalism. Good accessibility practice is on a par with, and a big round of applause again for Jane and for Chris, it's respecting copyright. It's the same sort of thing. It's GDPR, it's health and safety. It's that fundamental. So let's look at the 4 pillars of digital accessibility, because it's not about, you know, this is the legislation, these are the things you have to know about. It's actually about the way your organization works. It's about what the policy is. Is digital accessibility visible in policies? Have a look at your e-learning policy. Here's a challenge. Have a look at your e-learning policy, have a look at your disability policy, maybe have a look at your procurement policy, and just see whether or not there's anything there where digital accessibility is mentioned. Because if it's not in the policy, it probably isn't in the processes. Processes like procurement, like quality assurance. I can immediately tell how an organization's respecting accessibility if I can see that in the self-assessment review, that or the module, end of year module review, if there's an item in there about reflecting on digital accessibility, I know that that organization has got the culture. Is it in self-assessment? Is it in your job descriptions? And then the process, obviously processes are involved with practices. So is there appropriate role related training? If you give everybody a kind of basic introduction to accessibility, that is not a bad starting point. But what an e-learning specialist needs to know, and what your head of your IT systems needs to know, and what your sociology lecturer needs to know, and your media lecturer needs to know, and your librarian needs to know, and so on, they are all different, because accessibility, digital accessibility, depends on the tools you use, the content you create, and the experiences that you give to students, and the way you communicate with them. And that brings us finally then to people, because it's one thing knowing how to do accessible things, how to make accessible content, how to check whether or not the tools you're using with your students are accessible or not. It's another thing to actually tell the students how to exploit the accessibility that's built into them. You can have a fantastically accessible virtual learning environment with loads of accessible content, but if nobody's told the student what that would translate to in terms of personalization, in terms of the way they could work more productively and effectively, you've actually wasted quite a lot of time. So those are the 4 pillars. What I want to do is to now just talk about it now as what does it really look like and what does it feel like? And let's start with the feeling, because ultimately accessibility is about imagination. And if you're creating content or creating learning experiences for people like yourself, then that's great. But unless you have a complete sense of all the range of people that you might be dealing with, that's going to be limited. And basically, the more you expand that envelope of imagination, the more accessible you'll become, creating content for people that are not like me, that are different from me, have different needs and preferences and skills. So let's just, that was the feeling-y bit. Let's just talk for a minute to make sure that we're all on the same page. What do we mean? And I'm not going to talk about standards. I might mention them later, but not now. I want to talk about what it means as a user. It means I can magnify content. I can not just magnify it, but when I magnify it, it doesn't sort of scroll off the edge of the page and mean that I can't see it. I'm having to scroll left and right. So it magnifies, it reflows. It means I can change colors and contrasts. You don't have to be disabled to benefit from that. You might just want to be working in a dark room or a bright room and change the colors and contrasts accordingly. It means you can understand images that you can't see. And it's not just about blind people. I have worked with so many flat pack furniture purchases over the last few years where I see the image. I have no problem seeing the image. I still don't have a clue what it's trying to tell me. And so just a few words, a bit of alternative text would have made all the difference. Understanding videos that perhaps you can't see or you can't hear, just small things that you could do that would make a difference. It means I could operate everything either by mouse or by keyboard, or indeed by voice with the appropriate software. It means I could use different devices. I could be accessing something on my phone and still being able to use it effectively compared to accessing it on my laptop. It means, and this is a really important thing for everybody, it means that that content has been structured just using the inbuilt things like headings, lists, etc., so that I can navigate instantly through a document. It doesn't matter if it's 10 pages long or 100 pages long. I can find exactly where I need in that document in seconds just by pulling up a list of links, or by navigating by the page landmarks if I'm using a screen reader, or by pulling up a list of hyperlinks, or by just using keystrokes that take me to the next graphic or the next table, or navigating around a table instantly because it's been set up in such a way that it's very easy for me to orientate where I am. And it means, finally, using text to speech if I want to have something read to me rather than me read it out with my eyes. And there's plenty of times that's really helpful. The number of times you might be making notes on something, but not necessarily making notes in a Word document. I often work with mind maps, so I'll have a piece of paper in front of me. I'll be sketching something out, listening to content, sketching out ideas, so I don't have to constantly look at screen, book, or one screen, another screen, or swap windows. There's a range of ways in which text to speech is just brilliant for lots of users. We're talking about productivity. We're talking about personalization. So let's then talk about, if that's all the great things that accessibility can do, what gets it so complicated? Why does it become something that people want to approach with silver bullets and garlic? So it's because there's actually a big accessibility spectrum that we often misunderstand, because we only start at the top end of that spectrum, at one extreme of the spectrum that is virtually meaningless to virtually everybody in your organization. This is what most people understand by digital accessibility. And on the right hand side here we have a screenshot from one of the automated testing tools. Don't over rely on automated testing. They cannot pick up more than about 50% of the issues, but they're good for the 50% they can do. But when you look at that and you read down, oh my goodness, I've got an invalid WAI ARIA role, state, or property. I better fix that. Well, I would fix it if I had a clue what it means. And that's the problem, that people think that that's the only understanding, the only touch point of accessibility that you can get involved with. Now, all that's good stuff for the right people, and the right people need to know about that. But they need to know what it means. They need to know who it affects. I could spend ages looking at these invalid WAI ARIA roles, and actually, when I talk to a disabled user, I talk to a screen reader user, and I often do this. I've got a blind friend of mine who's an accessibility engineer, and I'll say, I've got this problem. It's telling me this. Is that a big issue or a little issue? Because I know that it's a technical failure. And he'll say, that doesn't make very much difference at all. It might make a difference in some extreme context using a 5-year-old, 10-year-old screen reader on Internet Explorer, but basically, no, that's going to be fine for most people. So it's that sense of what the priorities are and what's important. Those are important, but that's only one part of accessibility. This is your big chance now to be wonderfully creative, because actually what teachers are dealing with is something completely different. Here, I've got a map, and I know I need to make that map accessible in some way. Maybe I need to do a description. So this is your creative 3 or 4 minutes. In the chat pane, I would like you to describe what you think the main features of that map are. And an alt text needs to be quite short as well. Roads, buildings, parks, and buildings. Okay, great. So Sheila's got us off to a start there. So somebody else might talk about the colours, the fonts, a map of Ashurst and Colbury Parish Council. Keep going. I love the fact we've got diversity here, and it's actually the diversity that I'm looking for. So I might have, Sarah's suggesting there, it might be simple as OS map. So I'll have a few more though. I'd like to see a few more. So there may be some symbols on there that need interpretation, a map of suburban space. So already what we're pulling out from the very different range of responses that you're giving, what we're picking out is that you don't know what the alternative text description would be unless you have a very clear sense of the teaching purpose of that map. So we've had a mention of symbols here. So if this was about identifying symbols, then that's what my description would have to cover. If this was about urban planning, or if it was about the position of services like pubs in relation to transport hubs like railway stations, then I would be drawing out completely different things. So we've got a broad range, and your Alternative text might be as simple as Sarah suggested there, Ordnance Survey map. And it might be much more detailed and much more complex, as Gizzy's given a nice example there. And the key thing is what Liz has said there. We need to know how the learner needs to interact with the map first, which is exactly right. And so the map could be used for all kinds of different purposes, and that would make it different. So, and the thing about this is that maps are actually exempt. Online maps are exempt from the legislation because without the teaching purpose, you have no idea how to describe that. The whole thing about a map is that it is a visualization of really complex data. So I could give you a 3-page description of that, and I could tell you the shape and the compass direction and the length of every road, and I could tell you the shape of the houses and the shape of the housing patterns, and I could tell you the kind of trees that were there and the kind of landscape and the ecosystems. But cognitively, that only makes sense to a person with vision. If you haven't got vision, that map is utterly useless unless you have a very clear and narrow teaching purpose. So we have to start somewhere, understanding that for some people, making that accessible, it just isn't going to work on some levels, because what would be better, if I want a genuine geographical exploration here, I'd probably be better with a tactile map, so somebody can feel the contours, feel the shape. And so we need to think that accessibility is sometimes about cognition as well, and it's about the experience. Now I've made this activity experiential for you. So let's imagine here is a technically accessible drag and drop, and you can program it so that every one of these peroxisome, rough ER, ribosome, chloroplast, all those labels could be technically used just with a keyboard, tabbing through to get to the label, clicking space to select it, tabbing through to the drop zone. This is your experience. You have a completely technically accessible piece of activity, but you as a blind person will hear, you'll pick up rough ER, and then it will say drop zone, orange kidney shaped lozenge with internal lines, drop zone, large smooth blue shape, drop zone, light green rectangular shape forming the background to almost all the other shapes, drop zone. And you're having to think to yourself, now which one of those most closely matches the description of the alt text in the textbook? This becomes an awful memory exercise. It's like listening to 300 shipping forecasts all joined together and having to remember which was the appropriate one for the shipping area that you're interested in on the day you were there. It's really a very unpleasant experience. Technically accessible, usability 0, pleasure -100. So that's where there are times when thinking through the accessibility is actually needs to get away from the digital side and think, is there a better way of doing this that would give a better experience? And then there's the kind of accidental accessibility. On this example here, this is based on using Xerti toolkits. I've got 3 ways I can do a close exercise, a gap fill exercise on Xerti toolkits. I could have drag and drop. I'll tell you what, my ADHD learners love that. Very quick and easy, very tactile. I tell you, it's utterly horrible for a screen reader user. The second one down, screen reader, works brilliantly. It was a bright, I'm even getting hints pop up there. It's very easy for some people, but it's not great if you can't spell. And then there's the bottom one with the drop down options. That might actually be better for most people, but it does make it an easier exercise pedagogically because you have exactly the same. You don't have any option for making different distractors in different questions. So there's a lot of pulling together different ideas pedagogically. Who's this best for? Accessible wise, who's it best for? Many of us will have legacy content which will struggle with. There's also informational accessibility. I talked earlier about what if you've got a fantastic resource, but nobody knows how to be able to use the accessibility that's built into it. Or if you do have guidance on using accessible documents, it's only in the disability part of your website. To find out about text-to-speech, you have to declare that you have a disability. Well, that's a deficit model, and it doesn't really excite people about declaring disabilities. Make sure that you talk about information like this as productivity preferences. So we've established compliant code won't guarantee accessibility. I've shown you some examples with that, especially that drag and drop. Standards compliance is okay. It's a good starting point, but it's only a semi-mature place to be, because accessibility maturity involves everyone. It's not just your e-learning folk, your VLE folk, your web manager. It's everybody according to their skills and their roles and their influences. So I'm just going to talk you quickly through an accessibility maturity model that's been developed with AbilityNet and myself, multiple lenses, cross-institution, student-centered. It's very simple. What it looks at is five possible stages of maturity. On the left, we've got luck. You know, a typical quote, well, with luck, we won't have any disabled learners. And then there's tokenism, and that's actually surprising to people, that you can have a fantastic learning support department, but it's still on the model only counts as tokenism, because if those learning support folk are simply helping people over barriers rather than helping the organization to demolish barriers in the first place, then that's not moved you very far forward. Having systems built to standards, great, so long as that the implications of that, when you're not creating a website, you're creating a PowerPoint, or you're working with teams or delivering documents or PDFs, that needs to be understood. And when that's understood and staff are using digital resources to maximize learner experience, then you are really beginning to move into maturity, because we're talking not about accessibility for accessibility's sake, we're talking about maximizing learner independence. Now, that's really good for disabled students, I can tell you, but it's actually good for every student that you teach. It's radical, to pick up from Sheila's perspective this morning. And then the last thing, the really mature is where you're actually realizing that, if I did this a different way, if I got some insights from my disabled students and I kind of sat down and said, this is what I want to do on the field course, for example, how can I make my field course better for you? You probably end up making it better for all kinds of other people you didn't realize as well. So when you look at institutions, we've done some piloting with this, which has been very interesting. When you look at institutions, we can then say, okay, look, those are your 5 stages from luck through to partnership. But you can look at those 5 stages through different lenses. What is it that's driving the institution? Who has responsibility? What's your model of disability? Is it a deficit model? Is it, you have dyslexia, so the problem's located in you? Or is it that our content doesn't work with text to speech, the problem's located in our content? The focus of effort, what are you focusing on? Getting compliant, or just getting really pedagogically brilliant for everyone? So there's these different lenses. And when we did the pilots with some folk, including some folk who are here, what was fascinating is that for an individual institution, it's the institutions along the bottom, we had this terrific range. Nobody was uniformly bad at everything. There would be some lenses that they were really good at, some lenses they were really bad at. And if you tracked any particular theme, like responsibility, well, actually responsibility was an interesting one. Not many people did very well at responsibility, but one organization did, but it kind of up and down like the Alps. So it's very individualized according to different institutions, their cultures, their expertise, their background. So I just want to give you a quick overview then as to how you can benefit from this, because there is the downloadable overview, the top level tool, and I meant to have the the URL handy, which I haven't. I'll have to get it to you in a second. So that's something that you can instantly download it, look at it, and it's got that level on there that you can begin to have those conversations with different people. There's then a much more evidenced online version, which I can show you. This is the one that we tweaked based on the pilot work we did. So this is an online afternoon training session where for each of the lenses, we ask questions. You know, does this happen? Does that happen? Does the other thing happen? And you select it, whether it happens yes, no, a bit, that sort of thing. And those different questions, there's evidence there, sources of evidence. So it's not touchy-feely. This is really, is it there? Is it not? Very evidence-based. And we've also mapped it to whether you deliver content, whether you support students, whether you are managing, etc. So that's that kind of, that's a deeper level there. And it gives you a score per lens, gives you gap analysis. We had some really good feedback from that. And then there's the institutional side of things where you end up with some role-related questions for individuals. So again, if I pull one of those across, I just got the last minute and I'll show you this. So this would be, depending on the role, within your institution, we pick out 10 or 15 people that are involved in delivery. We get all of them to fill in the appropriate form, or we choose the people involved in the library. They've got slightly different. There'll be overlap of some of the questions, but also distinctive questions. And that means that you get big breadth of staff contributing, identifying not just strengths and weaknesses, but variations as well. And it allows you to find out what's going well. And we also have a module level one for courses, which is based on different lenses.